They called her a failure the moment she signed the divorce papers, as if a single word could erase 10 years of quiet sacrifice. And tonight, under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, they said it again without even lowering their voices. Evelyn Carter heard every syllable as she stepped into the grand ballroom, her heels soft against polished marble, her presence unnoticed at first. Like a ghost slipping through a life that used to be hers, the air smelled of expensive perfume and aged whiskey, laughter echoing in smooth waves. And across the room stood Daniel Hayes, her ex-husband, perfectly tailored in a midnight suit, a glass of champagne in his hand as he held court among investors and executives, his confidence effortless, his smile practiced, the same smile he once used to reassure her while quietly dismantling everything they built together. "You remember her?" someone near the bar muttered, not bothering to whisper. Daniel's ex-wife. She couldn't keep up. A low chuckle followed, sharp and dismissive. Some people just aren't built for success. Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't slow, her expression calm, almost detached, but her senses sharpened, every light, every reflection, every glance cutting clearer than before. This room, this company, this empire, it all felt familiar in a way no one here could understand, because long before the tailored suits and polished speeches, she had been there, sketching ideas at a kitchen counter, refining strategies no one else could see yet, building something from nothing while Daniel chased recognition. And now he stood at the center of it all, ready to announce the biggest expansion deal in the company's history, a deal the room buzzed about like it was the crown jewel of his success. Evelyn moved closer, unnoticed still, blending into the edges of conversations. A server passed her with a tray of champagne. She declined with a small shake of her head. Her focus steady, the stage lights brightened slightly as Daniel stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks, his voice soon to command the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, smooth and assured. "Tonight marks a new chapter." Applause followed, warm and eager. The kind of applause that feeds egos and buries truths. Evelyn stopped just short of the front row, her gaze fixed on him, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with something far quieter, something colder, something final. Because while they saw a man celebrating his empire, she saw every unseen fracture beneath it, every signature that had been overlooked, every foundation laid in silence. And as the applause faded and Daniel lifted his glass slightly higher, preparing to seal his moment of triumph, Evelyn Carter took one final step forward into the light. And for the first time that night, someone noticed her, just a flicker of recognition, just enough to start a ripple, because the woman they had called a failure had just returned, and none of them realized yet that nothing in this room truly belonged to him anymore. The ripple started as a whisper, a subtle shift in attention that moved through the room like a change in temperature. One by one, heads turned, conversations faltered, and Daniel's voice, once steady and commanding, hesitated for just a fraction of a second as his eyes caught the figure now standing where no one expected her to be. Evelyn Carter, no longer blending into the edges, no longer invisible, just standing there in quiet stillness, her posture relaxed, her gaze unwavering, as if she had always belonged at the center of it all. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, recognition dawning slowly, uncomfortably, because the narrative they had repeated for years no longer fit the woman before them. Daniel recovered quickly, forcing a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Evelyn," he said, her name sounding foreign on his tongue, like something pulled from a distant memory he would rather forget. "I did not expect to see you here tonight." His tone carried the faint edge of condescension, carefully measured, as though he was still speaking to the woman he believed he had left behind, a woman who would shrink under the weight of his presence. But Evelyn did not move, did not offer an explanation. She simply held his gaze with a calm that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. Around them, the room held its breath, the soft hum of conversation replaced by a silence that pressed in from all sides. Because something about this moment felt different, as if the balance they had all accepted without question was beginning to tilt. Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Well," he continued, lifting his glass slightly, "as I was saying, this company has reached new heights through relentless focus and vision." A few polite nods followed, but the energy had shifted, attention no longer anchored to him alone. Evelyn took another small step forward, her heels making the faintest sound against the marble floor, and in that quiet movement, there was a certainty that did not belong to a guest. It belonged to someone who knew exactly where they stood, because while they had spent years defining her absence as failure, she had spent those same years building something far more precise, far more enduring, behind the scenes, through legal channels and silent negotiations, through signatures that were overlooked and decisions that were never questioned. She had traced every fracture in the foundation Daniel believed was his, and she had learned where it could be reshaped, where it could be claimed, the deal he was about to celebrate, the expansion he was presenting as his greatest achievement. It was not what it seemed. It had been structured long before tonight, guided by a hand he never thought to look for, Evelyn's hand. But none of them knew that yet, not the investors who watched with growing curiosity, not the executives who shifted uncomfortably in place, and certainly not Daniel, who still believed he was standing at the peak of his own creation, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to move. And as the silence stretched just a moment too long, as anticipation quietly replaced certainty, a single figure near the stage adjusted his glasses and stepped forward, a man whose presence carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to be announced. And for the first time that night, Daniel's confidence flickered, because something was about to be said that he had not prepared for, something that would change the way every person in that room understood the woman they had dismissed. And Evelyn Carter simply stood there, composed and unshaken, waiting, because she had not come back to be seen, she had come back to be recognized. The man stepped fully into the light, his presence quiet yet undeniable, the kind of authority that did not need applause to be recognized. And when he spoke, the room instinctively listened. "Before we proceed with the announcement," he said, his voice measured and clear, "there is a matter of ownership that must be formally acknowledged." A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion threading its way into the silence. Daniel's grip tightened slightly around his glass, the polished confidence he wore beginning to fracture at the edges. "I am not sure what you mean," he interjected, forcing a composed tone, but the question hung unanswered as the man unfolded a thin document, the crisp paper catching the chandelier light like something far more significant than it appeared. "Over the past 18 months," he continued, "a series of strategic acquisitions have quietly consolidated controlling interest in this company." Each word landed with deliberate precision, like pieces of a puzzle finally being placed where they belonged. Evelyn did not move, did not react. She simply watched as the truth, long hidden beneath assumptions and arrogance, began to surface in a room that had never thought to question its own narrative. "These acquisitions," the man said, adjusting his glasses slightly, "were executed through private entities, fully compliant with regulatory standards, and finalized under a single principal beneficiary." The room stilled completely now, anticipation tightening every breath. Daniel's expression shifted, not yet understanding, but no longer certain. "And that beneficiary," the man concluded, lifting his gaze, "is present with us this evening." The pause that followed was absolute, a suspended moment where time itself seemed to hesitate. And then, without urgency, without spectacle, Evelyn Carter took one step forward, the soft echo of her heel against marble sounding louder than any applause that had filled the room before. Recognition struck, like a sudden realization no one could ignore. Conversations that had once dismissed her now dissolved into stunned silence. Daniel's eyes locked onto her, searching for something familiar, something that would restore his sense of control, but finding none, because the woman standing before him was no longer defined by his memory of her. "That is not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But the certainty he clung to had already begun to slip away. The man beside him offered no reassurance, only the calm continuation of truth. "Miss Carter holds the majority stake and full controlling interest." The words settled heavily across the room, undeniable, irreversible. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, not triumphant, not cruel, simply clear, as if everything unfolding had already been decided long before tonight. Daniel took a step forward, his voice lower now, edged with something unfamiliar. "You expect me to believe that you orchestrated this without anyone noticing?" And for the first time, Evelyn spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying effortlessly through the silence. "You did notice," she said softly. "You just chose not to see." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any accusation, because they did not need to convince, they only needed to exist. The room shifted again, not with noise, but with understanding. The story they had believed no longer held. The roles they had assigned no longer fit. And as Evelyn stood there, composed and unshaken, it became clear that she had never returned to reclaim anything. She had returned because it had always been hers. And the empire they celebrated tonight had already changed hands long before they realized they were no longer applauding the right person. Silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, uneasily, as if the room itself was recalibrating around a truth it had not prepared to accept. The chandeliers still glowed the same warm gold. The glasses still caught the light. But nothing felt the same anymore, because the center of gravity had moved, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. Daniel stood frozen for a moment longer than he intended, the kind of pause that did not belong to a man in control, his mind racing to reconstruct a version of reality where this made sense, where he was still the architect, still the owner, still the one being applauded. But every detail he reached for slipped just out of place. "There must be some mistake," he said finally, his voice steady on the surface but lacking the quiet authority it once carried so effortlessly. The man beside him did not respond with argument, only with confirmation. "The documentation has been reviewed and verified by the board and external counsel," he replied calmly. "The transfer of control is complete." The words did not rise in volume, yet they echoed louder than anything that had been said all evening, because they did not invite debate, they ended it. A few executives shifted where they stood, their expressions carefully neutral, recalculating loyalties in real time. Investors who had been leaning toward Daniel now straightened, their attention redirecting with subtle precision, because power, once revealed, had a way of reorganizing everything around it. Evelyn watched it happen without a flicker of satisfaction, without any visible need to claim the moment. She did not raise her voice, did not step further into the spotlight, because she did not need to. The truth was already doing the work for her. Daniel turned toward her again, searching, his expression tightening just enough to betray the pressure building beneath it. "You think this changes anything?" he said, quieter now, the question carrying more weight than defiance. And for a brief moment, it was not arrogance speaking, it was disbelief, the last fragile thread of certainty trying to hold. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice calm when she answered. "It changes what was always true," she said, "nothing more, nothing less." And in that simplicity was a clarity that left no space for argument. Because this was not about taking something from him. It was about revealing what had never belonged to him in the first place. Around them, the room began to move again, but differently now. Conversations resumed in lower tones, no longer filled with easy confidence, but with careful observation. People who had once overlooked her now watched with a new awareness, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because they understood, perhaps for the first time, that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, precise and patient, until the moment it could no longer be ignored. The chairman inclined his head slightly toward Evelyn, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than introduction. And it was enough. No grand declaration was needed, no ceremony required. Because the shift had already happened, Daniel stood at the edge of that realization, his position unchanged in appearance, but fundamentally altered in meaning. The glass in his hand now just a prop, the stage beneath him no longer his to command, and Evelyn, who had once stood beside him unnoticed, now stood apart without effort, not elevated by spectacle, but defined by something far more enduring. And as the evening continued around them, as the music slowly returned and the rhythm of the gala resumed in a quieter, more measured way, it became clear that nothing had ended in that moment. Something far more significant had begun, because for the first time, the empire was no longer built on what people believed, it was built on what had finally been seen. No one announced the shift, but everyone adjusted to it. The kind of quiet recalibration that happens when power changes hands without permission. Conversations that once circled Daniel now drifted, subtly but unmistakably, toward Evelyn, not in crowds, not in open admiration, but in careful, measured steps. A glance held a second longer, a greeting offered with new intention. The room had not become louder. It had become sharper, more aware, and in that awareness, Evelyn moved with the same calm precision she had carried from the moment she walked in. She did not claim attention. She allowed it to find her. Daniel remained where he stood, but the space around him felt different now. Thinner, as if the air no longer carried his authority the way it had only minutes before. He watched as one of his senior executives hesitated before speaking to him, then turned slightly, acknowledging Evelyn instead, a small gesture. Almost imperceptible, but it landed with more force than any confrontation could have, because it was not defiance, it was recognition, and recognition could not be undone. Evelyn accepted each interaction with the same composed neutrality, a nod, a brief exchange, nothing excessive, nothing performative, because she did not need to prove anything. The proof was already present, embedded in every contract, every decision, every outcome that had quietly aligned in her favor long before tonight. A woman approached her, one who had once sat across from her at dinners filled with polite dismissal. "I did not realize," she began carefully, her voice softer now, recalibrated. Evelyn met her gaze without hesitation. "You were not supposed to," she replied, not unkindly, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Across the room, Daniel finally moved, setting his glass down with deliberate care, as if controlling that single action might restore the larger control he felt. Slipping away, he crossed the floor, each step measured, each movement calculated, stopping just short of where Evelyn stood, close enough for their conversation to remain private, but visible enough that the room would notice. "You planned this," he said, not accusing, not yet, but searching for something he could still define. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering the words. "No," she answered calmly. "I prepared." The distinction settled between them, quiet but absolute, because planning suggested a reaction, preparation revealed intention. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of realization pressing in from all sides. "And you waited," he said, more to himself than to her. And for the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice, only understanding. Evelyn did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She simply held his gaze with the same steady calm that had carried her through every unseen step of the journey that led here, because waiting had never been passive. It had been precise, deliberate, and necessary. The music in the background resumed its rhythm, soft and elegant, but the meaning of the evening had already shifted beyond celebration. This was no longer a night of announcements. It was a moment of clarity, a realignment of truth and perception. And as Daniel stood there, no longer at the center but no longer able to ignore it either, Evelyn turned slightly, her attention moving forward rather than back, because this moment was not her conclusion. It was her beginning, and the empire that had once overlooked her was now learning, in the quietest possible way, that she had never been absent, only unseen. The night did not end. It evolved, and Evelyn felt it in the subtle shifts that followed her every step. In the way conversations paused just slightly when she approached, in the way eyes no longer dismissed her but measured her, recalibrating every assumption they had once made. The ballroom remained bathed in warm light, the music smooth and uninterrupted, yet beneath it all ran a quiet current of awareness that had not existed before. Daniel stood where she had left him, still processing a reality that refused to return to its previous shape, but Evelyn did not look back again, because what had already been revealed no longer needed repetition. She moved toward a quieter corner of the room where the glass walls overlooked the city skyline, the lights below stretching endlessly, a reflection of something she understood better than anyone else in that room: how things were built, not in moments of applause, but in long, unseen stretches of time where no one was watching. A man approached her, older, composed, someone who had been present in the earliest days of the company. His expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "I had a feeling," he said, his voice low, almost respectful. "Not about how, but about you." Evelyn regarded him calmly. "You saw what was there," she replied, "not what was presented." He nodded slightly, understanding the difference. Because presentation had always been Daniel's strength, while substance had quietly been hers, across the room. The board members had begun to gather. Their conversations no longer centered on projections or deals, but on structure, on authority, on the future, and where it now truly resided. One of them glanced toward Evelyn, then another, their attention aligning without the need for formal direction. Because the structure had already changed, they were simply catching up to it. Evelyn felt no urgency to join them. Not yet. Control did not require immediate action. It required clarity, and clarity was already settling into place. She allowed herself a single breath, steady and unhurried, her gaze resting on the city lights beyond the glass. Remembering the nights she had spent alone after the divorce, when silence had not been power but absence, when every decision felt uncertain, every step unsteady. And yet even then, something in her had refused to collapse completely, something quiet but persistent, that insisted she was not finished, that what had been taken from her did not define what she could build. And so she had started again, not loudly, not publicly, but with precision, learning where influence truly lived, understanding how ownership could be structured beyond appearances, how control could exist without recognition. And now, standing here, she understood that none of it had been accidental. Every choice had led here, not to prove anything to Daniel, not to correct what others had said, but to arrive at a place where none of it mattered anymore. Behind her, footsteps approached again, lighter this time, uncertain. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his presence no longer commanding the room, but still carrying the weight of someone who had not yet fully accepted the shift. "What happens now?" he asked, not with challenge, but with something closer to honesty. Evelyn turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Now," she said, her voice calm and even, "it becomes what it was always meant to be." The answer was not detailed, not strategic, but it did not need to be, because the future no longer required explanation, it required execution, and that was something she had already mastered. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, searching for something he could still hold on to, but finding only a clarity that did not leave space for negotiation. And as he stepped back, not defeated but no longer certain, Evelyn turned her attention forward once more, toward the room, toward the board, toward the structure that had already begun to realign around her. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without claiming the spotlight, she stepped into her position fully, not as someone who had returned, but as someone who had finally been seen. The room no longer needed an announcement to recognize where authority had settled. It revealed itself in the smallest adjustments, in the way conversations paused when Evelyn approached, in the way decisions that once flowed automatically toward Daniel now hesitated, waiting, redirecting, recalibrating. She stepped toward the cluster of board members who had gathered near the stage, their posture formal, their expressions carefully composed. But beneath that composure was something unmistakable, acknowledgement, not forced, not exaggerated, but real, the kind that only followed certainty. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a measured presence, inclined her head slightly. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone precise, "we should discuss next steps." There was no question in her voice, no hesitation, only alignment. Evelyn met her gaze with the same calm clarity she had carried all evening. "Of course," she replied, her voice even, neither rushed nor delayed, because she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. They moved a few steps aside, not to hide, but to create a space where clarity could exist without performance. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass walls behind them, a quiet reminder of the scale of what was now in motion. "There are several initiatives pending approval," another board member added, his tone respectful but direct, including the expansion Daniel was about to announce. The name lingered briefly in the air, not as authority, but as reference. Evelyn nodded once, absorbing the information without reaction, because she already knew. She had structured those initiatives herself, shaped them in ways no one had traced back to her. "We will review them," she said simply, not dismissing, not confirming, but placing them exactly where they belonged, under her control. Across the room, Daniel watched, his position unchanged yet undeniably altered. He was no longer the axis around which Everything turned, and that realization did not arrive with noise. It settled in quietly, like a truth that could not be argued away. He saw the way the board leaned toward her, the way their attention held, the way decisions were no longer framed around him. And for the first time, he understood that control had not been taken from him in a single moment. It had been redirected over time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to reclaim. Evelyn listened as the discussion continued, each point clear, each concern measured, but her focus extended beyond the immediate. She was not here to maintain what existed. She was here to redefine it, to shape it into something that reflected not ambition alone, but structure, stability, and intention, the things she had built in silence while others sought recognition. We will also need to address leadership roles, the woman with sharp eyes added carefully. The implication present but unspoken. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She allowed the moment to settle, because decisions made too quickly often served urgency rather than purpose, and she had learned the difference well. "We will," she said at last, her tone calm but decisive. "But not tonight." The answer was not avoidance. It was precision, because tonight was not about restructuring positions. It was about establishing truth, and that had already been done. The board members exchanged brief glances, then nodded, understanding the weight behind her restraint. Because control did not require immediate demonstration, it required consistency, and she had already shown that. The music continued its steady rhythm, the gala unfolding once more around them, but now with a different awareness woven through it, not loud, not obvious, but present in every interaction, every glance, every decision that would follow from this moment forward. Evelyn stepped back slightly from the group, her gaze moving across the room one last time, not searching, not questioning, simply observing. And in that quiet observation was a certainty that no longer needed validation, because what had been unseen was now undeniable, and what had been denied was now established. And as she turned her attention forward, toward what came next rather than what had been, it became clear that this was no longer a story about returning. It was a story about taking rightful place, and doing so without ever needing to raise her voice. The shift did not stop at recognition. It moved deeper, into decisions that had not yet been spoken aloud, into structures that had not yet been questioned, and Evelyn felt it in the way the board's attention lingered even after their brief exchange, as if waiting for a signal that did not need to be given. Because the direction was already clear, she stepped away from them with quiet composure, allowing the space to settle, allowing the room to absorb what had changed without forcing it into something louder than it needed to be. The music continued, the soft clink of glasses resumed, but beneath it all, there was a new awareness threading through every interaction. Daniel remained near the center of the room, but no longer at its center of gravity, his presence still noticeable, still composed, yet no longer defining the atmosphere around him. He watched as a group of investors who had once surrounded him shifted their attention, not abruptly, not disrespectfully, but with a subtle precision that spoke louder than any confrontation. They approached Evelyn instead, their expressions measured, their tone respectful. "Miss Carter," one of them began, extending a hand. "We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss the long-term direction of the company." The words were careful, but their intent was clear. They were not seeking approval from Daniel anymore. They were aligning with her. Evelyn accepted the gesture with a calm nod, her handshake steady, her gaze direct. "There will be time for that," she said, her voice even, not dismissive, but controlled, because timing, she had learned, was as important as action. They nodded in understanding, stepping back without pressing further, because they recognized the difference between urgency and authority. Across the room, Daniel observed the exchange, the realization settling in layers, not all at once, but steadily. That what he had believed to be permanent had always been conditional, that influence could shift without announcement, that control could be redefined without conflict. He moved toward the bar, more out of habit than intention. But even there, the dynamic had changed. The bartender who once greeted him with immediate attention now glanced toward Evelyn first, a small detail, almost insignificant, yet impossible to ignore. Daniel's reflection caught briefly in the mirrored surface behind the bar, and for a moment, he saw himself not as the man the room once revolved around, but as someone standing just outside of it, not excluded, but no longer central. Evelyn, meanwhile, allowed the evening to unfold without interruption. She did not rush to assert her position. She did not gather attention for its own sake. Because the foundation had already been established, what followed would not require force, only consistency. She moved toward the edge of the room again, where the city stretched out beyond the glass, the lights steady and expansive, a quiet reminder of scale, of time, of everything that existed beyond a single moment. She rested her hand lightly against the cool surface, her reflection faint beside the skyline. And in that reflection, she saw not the woman they had once dismissed, but the sum of every decision she had made since, every step taken without recognition, every moment where she had chosen not to react, but to build. Behind her, the room continued to adjust, conversations deepening, alliances subtly realigning. And somewhere within that movement, the company itself began to shift, not in visible structure, not yet, but in direction, in tone, in the quiet understanding that what came next would not follow the same path as before. And as Evelyn stood there, composed and unshaken, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a transition no one could reverse, because the power she held was not newly gained. It had simply been revealed, and once revealed, it could no longer be unseen. The evening settled into a quieter rhythm, but beneath that calm surface, everything had shifted into something sharper, more intentional, as if every person in the room had become aware that they were now part of a moment that would be remembered long after the music faded. Evelyn remained by the glass wall for a moment longer, her reflection faint against the skyline, the city stretching endlessly below like a reminder that power was never contained to a single room. It moved, it evolved, it belonged to those who understood how to hold it without announcing it. She turned back toward the room with the same composed stillness, her gaze moving across faces that now carried a different kind of attention. Not curiosity, not judgment, but recognition, the kind that could not be undone once it settled in. A member of the board approached her again, this time without hesitation. "We have already begun reviewing the restructuring options," he said, his tone direct but measured. "There are decisions that will require your immediate input." Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, because urgency had never dictated her choices. "We will address them in the morning," she replied, calmly. "Tonight, nothing needs to be forced." The answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it reinforced what the room was still learning, that control did not rush, it defined the pace. The board member nodded, understanding the shift not just in authority, but in approach across the room. Daniel stood in quiet observation, no longer attempting to reclaim the attention that had moved beyond him, but still processing the reality that had unfolded with such precision that it left no room for denial. He watched Evelyn not as someone he had once known, but as someone he had never truly understood. And in that realization, something in his posture changed, not defeat, not resignation, but a recognition that the narrative he had believed no longer applied. Evelyn moved through the room once more, not to gather attention, but to acknowledge it. Each interaction brief, each exchange deliberate. She did not linger, she did not perform, because there was nothing left to prove. The proof had already settled into every corner of the evening. The investors who had approached her earlier now stood in quieter discussion, their tone more thoughtful, their focus shifted from speculation to alignment. The executives who had once followed Daniel's lead now recalibrated, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, because influence, once clarified, naturally reorganized those around it. The music softened slightly, the lighting dimmed just enough to signal the evening's gradual close, but no one moved to leave just yet, as if they understood that something more than a celebration had taken place, something that required a moment longer to fully register. Evelyn paused near the center of the room, her gaze steady, her presence no longer questioned, and in that stillness, she understood that the hardest part had never been reclaiming anything. It had been allowing the truth to reveal itself without interruption, allowing time to do what confrontation never could. And now that it had, there was nothing left to reclaim, nothing left to correct, only something to lead. Daniel stepped closer once more, not with the same certainty as before, but with a clarity that had replaced it. "You did not come back to take it," he said quietly, the statement more realization than accusation. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice calm, unwavering. "I never gave it away," she replied, and in that moment, the final piece settled into place, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a quiet certainty that left no space for doubt. And as the room slowly began to move again, as conversations resumed with new understanding, as the night edged toward its close, it became clear that this was not the end of a story, but the point where everything truly began, because what had once been hidden was now undeniable, and what had once been dismissed had become the foundation for everything that would follow. By the time the last notes of music softened into the background, the room no longer felt like a place of celebration, but a space that had quietly witnessed a shift no one could undo. Guests began to move toward the exits in small, measured waves, their conversations quieter now, more thoughtful, as if each of them was recalibrating not just what they had seen, but what it meant. Evelyn remained where she stood for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Because endings, she had learned, were rarely loud. They were defined by what lingered after everything else had faded. A board member approached her once more, this time with a different tone, less formal, more aligned. "We will prepare the documents for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice steady. "Everything will be ready for your review." Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging without urgency. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm, because preparation had always been her language, not reaction. Across the room, Daniel had not yet left. He stood near the edge now, no longer surrounded, no longer observed in the same way, but still present, still processing, the distance between them no longer defined by space, but by something far more permanent. He watched as people passed by Evelyn with quiet respect, as conversations adjusted around her, as the structure he once commanded reformed itself without resistance. And for the first time, he did not try to interrupt it. He simply observed. Because there was nothing left to correct, Evelyn finally moved toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying the same quiet certainty she had brought into the room. No one stopped her, no one questioned her. They simply made space, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because they understood, even if only now, that she was no longer someone who needed permission to be there. The doors opened with a soft motion, the cool night air meeting her as she stepped outside, the city stretching before her in endless lines of light and motion, a world that did not pause, did not wait, but continued forward, just as she always had. She paused briefly at the top of the steps, her gaze lifting toward the skyline, the reflection of the building's lights fading behind her, replaced by something far broader, far more expansive. And in that moment, there was no triumph. No need to revisit what had been said or done, only a quiet understanding that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to. Behind her, the doors closed softly, the sound almost imperceptible, yet final in a way that words could not capture. Daniel stepped out moments later, stopping a few feet behind her, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to be heard. "I thought I understood how this worked," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been, not defeated, but reflective. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She let the words settle, just as she had let everything else settle throughout the night. Before she finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying no edge of resentment. "You understood what you could control," she said, "not what you never saw." The distinction hung in the air between them, clear and unchallenged. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of realization no longer something he resisted, but something he accepted, because it was no longer a question of how it had happened, but a recognition that it had always been possible. Evelyn stepped forward then, descending the steps without looking back, her movement simple, unforced, as if this path had always been hers to take. The city lights reflecting in her eyes, steady and unwavering, and as she walked away from the building that once defined her absence and now marked her presence, it became clear that she had not come back to reclaim a place within it. She had simply stepped into the place that had always been hers, and in doing so, she left behind not a void, but a truth that would remain long after the night had ended. The city did not sleep, and neither did the weight of what had shifted. It followed Evelyn into the quiet rhythm of the night as she walked along the sidewalk, the sound of distant traffic blending with the soft echo of her steps, each one measured, each one steady. The cool air carried a clarity that the ballroom never could, free from expectation, free from observation, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a moment to feel it fully, not the victory they might have called it, but the alignment, the quiet certainty that everything had settled exactly where it belonged. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand, a message from the board already waiting, precise, efficient, confirming the early meeting, outlining the first steps that would follow. She read it once, then locked the screen, not out of disinterest, but because urgency no longer dictated her pace. She had built this moment to move with intention, not reaction. Behind her, the building stood tall, its windows still glowing, but no longer defining her. It was no longer a place she had been removed from. It was simply one part of a structure she now understood completely. Across the street, a black car idled quietly, the driver stepping out as she approached, opening the door with a respectful nod. She paused briefly before getting in, her gaze lifting once more to the skyline, the lights stretching endlessly, each one a reminder that control was never about a single space. It was about understanding the system that connected them all. She stepped into the car without hesitation, the door closing softly behind her, the city beginning to move again beyond the glass as the car pulled away from the curb. Inside, the silence was different, not empty, but composed. The kind of silence that followed clarity. She leaned back slightly, her reflection faint in the window, not the woman they had once dismissed, not even the one who had walked into the gala, but something more defined, more complete, because she was no longer reacting to what had been done to her. She was moving forward with what she had built. Her thoughts did not return to Daniel, not in the way they once might have. There was no need to revisit the past, no need to measure what had been lost or taken, because it no longer held weight in the present. What mattered now was what came next. The structure she would shape, the decisions she would make, the direction she would set, not to prove anything, not to correct anything, but to create something that no longer depended on recognition to exist. The car turned onto a wider avenue, the city opening up in long lines of light. And for a moment, she remembered the nights after the divorce when everything had felt uncertain, when silence had been something she endured rather than something she commanded, when every step forward had required more strength than she thought she had. And yet she had taken those steps anyway, not because she was certain, but because she refused to remain where she had been left. And now, sitting here, she understood that those moments had not been setbacks. They had been the foundation, the quiet construction of something that could not be undone once it was complete. Her phone vibrated again, another message, another confirmation, the world already beginning to respond to the shift that had taken place. She glanced at it briefly, then set it aside once more, because she did not need to chase what was already aligning. Outside, the city continued its steady motion, unaware of the details, but shaped by them nonetheless. And as Evelyn looked out at the endless movement of lights and streets and distant buildings, it became clear that the night had not ended anything. It had simply revealed what had been waiting, and what lay ahead was not a continuation of the past, but something entirely her own, something she would define not with words, but with the same quiet precision that had brought her here in the first place. Morning arrived without hesitation, the city already in motion by the time Evelyn stepped out of the car and into the quiet precision of the building's upper floor, where glass walls framed the skyline in pale daylight, and everything felt sharper, more defined, as if the night before had not ended, but simply transitioned into something more concrete. The conference room was prepared before she arrived, documents arranged neatly, screens lit with projections waiting to be reviewed. The board members were already seated, their posture attentive, their conversations hushed, not out of uncertainty, but out of alignment, because what had been revealed the night before no longer needed explanation. It needed execution. Evelyn entered without announcement, and yet the room responded instantly, subtle but unmistakable. Chairs straightened, attention focused, and for a brief moment, silence settled, not awkward, not forced, but respectful, the kind of silence that acknowledged authority. without needing to declare it. She took her seat at the head of the table, not as a gesture, but because it was where she belonged, the documents before her crisp and precise, reflecting decisions that had already begun to take shape long before this meeting was called. We have outlined the restructuring priorities. The woman with sharp eyes began, her tone efficient, beginning with leadership realignment and strategic direction for the next quarter. Evelyn listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her presence anchoring the room in a way that did not require effort, because control, once understood, did not need to be demonstrated, it simply existed. The presentation moved forward, data displayed in clean lines, projections discussed with careful attention, but what stood out was not the information itself, it was the shift in how it was delivered, no longer framed to impress, no longer structured to elevate a single voice, but aligned toward clarity, toward sustainability, toward something that would endure beyond a single narrative. Evelyn reviewed each point with quiet precision, asking questions when necessary, not to challenge, but to refine, to ensure that every decision was grounded in something more stable than assumption. The room responded to her in kind, not defensive, not performative, but focused, because they understood that this was no longer about maintaining appearances, it was about building something that could not be undone by perception alone. Daniel arrived late, not by intention, but by hesitation. He paused briefly at the doorway before stepping inside. The shift from the night before still settling into place. The room acknowledged him, but only briefly, their attention returning quickly to Evelyn. Because the structure had already been established, he took a seat along the side, no longer at the center, no longer directing the flow, but present, observing, absorbing, and for the first time, he did not attempt to interrupt. He listened, because there was nothing left to assert. Evelyn did not acknowledge him directly, not out of disregard, but because the moment did not require it. What needed to be addressed was already unfolding. The meeting progressed with steady clarity, decisions outlined, timelines set, responsibilities assigned, each element aligning into a structure that felt both new and inevitable. Because it was not built on reaction, it was built on understanding, and as the final points were reviewed, as the room settled into a quiet sense of direction, it became clear that what had changed was not just leadership, it was perspective. The company was no longer driven by visibility, it was guided by substance, and that difference would define everything that followed. Evelyn closed the folder before her with a soft, deliberate motion, her gaze lifting briefly to meet the room, not seeking agreement, but confirming alignment, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without making a declaration, she set the tone for everything that would come next, because this was no longer about reclaiming what had been lost, it was about shaping what had never been fully realized. And as the meeting concluded, as chairs shifted and quiet conversations resumed, the future did not feel uncertain, it felt defined, not by what had been said, but by what had already been established. And in that quiet certainty, Evelyn Carter moved forward, not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had always held it, now finally seen in the light of day. The room slowly emptied, not with the usual casual ease of a meeting's end, but with a quiet awareness that something irreversible had taken place. Chairs slid back with softened movements. Conversations resumed in low tones, and one by one, the board members stepped out, carrying with them not just decisions, but a new understanding of what the company had become. Evelyn remained seated for a moment longer after the last document was closed, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady, not fixed on anything in particular, but present in a way that required no movement. Because the momentum had already begun, she did not need to chase it. She had created it. Daniel stayed behind, the door closing softly as the final footsteps faded down the hallway. The silence that followed was different from the night before, less charged, more defined, as if both of them now stood on ground that no longer shifted beneath their feet. He moved closer, not with the confidence he once carried, but with a clarity that had replaced it. "I thought control meant being seen," he said, his voice calm, not searching for validation, but acknowledging something he had only just begun to understand. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression composed, her eyes steady. "It never did," she replied, her tone even. "It meant being understood, even when no one was looking. The distinction settled between them. Simple, undeniable. Daniel nodded slowly. The weight of that realization no longer something he resisted, but something he accepted, because it explained more than any argument ever could, the years he had spent building outward, projecting strength, commanding attention, and the years she had spent building inward, structuring something that did not depend on recognition to exist. "You could have told me," he said after a moment, not as a challenge, but as a quiet reflection. Evelyn held his gaze, not with regret, not with resentment, but with clarity. "You would not have listened," she answered, and there was no accusation in her voice, only truth, because listening required a willingness to see beyond what was already believed, and that had never been part of the world he operated in. Daniel exhaled softly, a faint shift in his posture, as if something unspoken had finally settled into place. Not closure, not resolution, but understanding, and for the first time, it was enough. Evelyn stood then, her movement unhurried, deliberate. She gathered the folder in front of her, not as something to hold on to, but as something already integrated into what came next. She walked toward the door, pausing only briefly as she reached it, her hand resting lightly against the handle. The moment quiet, unforced. Daniel watched her, not as someone who had lost something, but as someone who had finally seen what had always been there. "What happens to me?" he asked, the question no longer driven by fear or control, but by a genuine search for place within a structure that no longer centered around him. Evelyn turned slightly, meeting his gaze one last time, her expression calm, unwavering. "That depends on what you choose to build next."